My name is Doug Sears. I have a long and obtuse title, Associate Provost and Assistant to the President, and I am here today representing both President Brown and Provost Campbell. President Brown, as we speak, is in India, and David Campbell is coming back from Washington, D.C., where he was doing something which I'm quite familiar with, but it was a lot less inspiring than what he has given me to do today, which is a much more uplifting. He was involved in some regulatory matters down there that were absolutely pressing and urgent, and sends his deep regrets. So on behalf of the university, I want to say we gather today here at Hillel to celebrate, to remember, and to promise. To celebrate, we want to celebrate the work and the generosity of Alvin and Shirley Slater, a generosity that has made possible the establishment of the Slater Professorship for Jewish Holocaust Studies. We celebrate the inauguration of this position and congratulate Professor Stephen Katz on assuming the duties and responsibilities that go with this important professorship, and we wish him well in what we will call this wholesome and necessary work. My father has a prayer. I'm a Presbyterian by upbringing, and my father at Thanksgiving often gives thanks for wholesome work. That is, he's thankful his children have wholesome work, and what could be more wholesome than the great undertaking Steve Katz is starting on. We remember today the victims of the Holocaust as precious individuals with the same hopes, fears, pains, and joys as our own. We remember the stark historical fact, I emphasize fact, of the Holocaust, consistent with the express wishes of Alvin Slater, who wrote in the enabling documents for this professorship, for the further study of the Shoah, so that this fact will not become a mere footnote to the history of the 20th century. So we remember the victims, we remember this wish expressed by Alvin Slater, and by listening to Professor Katz tonight as he speaks about conditions of resistance, we begin the work of the professorship by being students, by listening, thinking, comprehending, remembering, and being inspired and moved by what he has to say. Finally, we promise, if you get married in the Quaker tradition, as I did, you take oaths, although the Quakers don't take oaths, as you know. You affirm in front of a group of people what your promises are to each other, but you do it in front of people. And we, Boston University, as an institution, I believe, have promises to keep to the Slater family and to the broader community that is invested both economically and, I would say, spiritually and emotionally in this professorship and in the work of the Center for Judaic Studies. Our undertaking as an institution at the most pragmatic level is to keep our promises, to husband the resources that have been entrusted to our care, but also to be faithful to the purposes of this professorship by honoring the wishes of the family, the donors, so that we are always and in perpetuity faithful to these wishes and that we fulfill them. And those are the three big things that I wanted to mention today as the university's commitments and obligations as I see them and on behalf of the university. Before we move further into the speech, we have a wonderful little piece of, I want to say film, which tells you that I'm over 50, digital information conveying Elie Wiesel's wishes to this gathering, and best wishes.
Provost Campbell, my fellow professors at Boston University, students, and you, my dear friend Steve, you know very well that had it not been for the fact that I had a previous commitment which I couldn't cancel in New York, I certainly would have been here this afternoon and talk about the subject and about the people involved in this extraordinary project. Of course, I do want to congratulate the Alvin and Shirley Slater families for endowing this professorship, and I do want to congratulate Professor Katz for being the holder of this professorship. Many of us know that few courses are as important, as painfully meaningful as the courses on whatever is linked to what is so poorly called the Holocaust. Without it, a university today would not be what it should be, a center of learning and a representation of a collective quest for understanding and perhaps for some reconciliation with the past, which is more difficult, and it's getting more difficult from day to day because of what's happening in the world today. I think that Professor Katz will teach with talent, with conviction, with sensitivity, these courses that are, even today, to those of us who have been involved in keeping memory alive, those courses seem so delicate and nevertheless so necessary. So, what else can I say to you, Steve? I wish you to be lucky enough to have students worthy of the subject and of you. And I wish the students to be fortunate enough to have you as their teacher. Good evening and good luck to all of you.
I do have the honor to introduce our speaker and our incumbent for this professorship, Professor Stephen Katz, and I can echo Elie Wiesel's words and saying that we know, or play off those words, we know that Professor Katz is worthy of this great work. We know that because of his dedication, because of his extraordinary education and the road he has traveled in his life, and that he will bring enlightenment and moral seriousness to what he does. Briefly, he has been here for over a decade. He has a PhD from Cambridge University in Judaic Studies and Philosophy. He has studied and he started at Rutgers and then moved over to Cambridge. He's held professorships at Cornell, visiting professorships at Yeshiva University. His is a most distinguished resume, wonderfully long for those who want to go on the web, which you can do these days and have a look. But I am very confident, and on behalf of David Campbell, I want to tell you that we believe very strongly that he is worthy of this important work and that our students will be inspired by him. He was gracious enough to let me have a look at his talk for the weekend so that I would better understand what he was doing, and it was, of course, instructive for me, and there's always something new to be learned, and I know that we begin the work of learning more with him today. So, Professor Katz, congratulations and best wishes on this work first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Today, we have all come together to celebrate the creation of the Alvin J. and Shirley Slater Chair in Holocaust Studies. This is the first chair in Judaic Studies here at Boston University and signals the recognition of the important place that the subject has at this university. President Emeritus John Silber, on the occasion of the creation of the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies, wrote, Our culture is profoundly dependent upon Jewish culture that has shaped the moral vision not only of Jews but also of Muslims and Christians. We are all, quote, people of the book. Boston University must have a center for Judaic Studies. It will have a great one, end of quote. The munificent gift of the Slater family is the second major contribution following the great generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Ira Rennett in making this goal a reality. Given the presence of Professor Wiesel at Boston University for over 30 years, the naming of the center in his honor, it is only appropriate that the first endowed chair should be in Holocaust Studies. I think it is correct to say that the Holocaust is not only the most significant event in Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, but is also an event of world historical significance, whose reality and interpretation is relevant to almost every discipline in the social sciences and humanities. as well as to those who are creating new technologies and fostering a technological mentality in our scientific programs. Through their generosity and commitment, Mr. and Mrs. Slater have ensured that this now fundamental subject will be taught to generation upon generation of students. I am only sorry that Mr. Slater did not live to see the implementation of this vision, but I am certain that, as the traditional phrase has it, his memory will be for a blessing. At this time, I would also like to thank President Brown, who is in Asia, Provost Campbell, former Dean Jeffrey Henderson, who I see here, and I thank him for coming, my faculty colleagues who were all involved in deciding who the first holder of the Slater Chair would be. I am deeply appreciative of the honor they extended to me by naming me as the first occupant of the Slater Chair. I would also like to thank three people who have worked very hard in organizing today's event. The first two, Ms. Mary Tambaya and Mr. Gene Lyman of the university's Alumni Affairs Office, have been helpful in myriad ways. The third, Ms. Pagel-Zoka, the administrative assistant at the Wiesel Center, has done much of the real work that makes such an event happen. She is a real partner in everything that happens at the Wiesel Center, and I thank her most sincerely. Finally, I want to say I'm deeply indebted to my children, Tamar and Yehuda, who's here, who I didn't expect, who's working out of town, and made a special effort to get here. They let Daddy sit in the study for lots of long hours when they would have preferred that I was playing with them, and so I really owe them a great debt. And lastly, to my wife, Rebecca, who never likes me to thank her on these occasions, I'll just say what Rabbi Akiva said 2,000 years ago, my honor is her honor. Now, in thinking about the talk, I don't want to read a talk. I want to talk, however, about an important subject. When I thought about the possible subjects for today, it obviously should deal with Holocaust studies, but I thought it should not deal with questions of German ideology and German behavior and Nazi malice and all the hideous things that were involved in the final solution, but rather something on the Jewish side of the equation. And the most important thing on the Jewish side of the equation, in a sense, which is much misunderstood, the subject of many canards, a great deal of confusion, is the subject of Jewish resistance. And so I thought I might devote a few remarks to that subject, not to resistance itself, though I'll say a little bit about that at the end of the lecture, but rather about what one really needs to know to enter into this conversation. In other words, in order to participate intelligently and reasonably in evaluating how the Jews behaved, one has to know a lot of things. And I hope to point out some of them. Most of them have to do with context and chronology. As to the context, I would begin with German Jewry. Already after Hitler came to power in 1933, the Jews of Germany were not passive. They responded in a wide variety of ways. They organized self-help. They organized soup kitchens for the hungry. They organized educational programs. Rabbi Leo Beck, the head of the Reichsvertretung, and Martin Buber, the head of the adult education process, all organized a broad program to reinforce the moral dignity and the strength of German Jewry. In addition, German Jews reacted in a most dramatic way. They left Germany. And when Austria was taken in the Anschluss, they left Austria. Of about 700,000 Jews in Germany and Austria, about 410,000 left. They were not passive. For those who stayed, we know that right till 1943, about 10,000 Jews stayed and hid in Germany. They hid 5,000 in Berlin, they hid elsewhere, and of those, about 3,000 survived. As late as 1943, we have Zionist youth groups active, working to bring young Jews out of Germany to Switzerland. The second thing that needs to be recalled is that when the war began, this is a crucial point, we see the story backwards. We know what happened in 1943, 1944, 1945. We know about Auschwitz and Treblinka and the final solution. In 1939, when the war began, September 1, 1949, with the invasion of Poland, the Jews nor anyone else had an idea of the final solution. Despite the claims of scholars like Lucy Davidovich, a distinguished scholar, an old friend, the fact is there was no plan for the final solution in 39 or 40 until really the invasion of Russia in the middle of 41. Therefore, one cannot blame the Jews in 39 as they start to become the subjects of ghettoization in late 39 and 40 of not acting differently. They did not see, and no one else saw, what would become of the Jewish people. Secondly, we need to know that as late as 41, there was enormous division in the German hierarchy, for example, between Himmler and the leaders of the army on what should be done with the Jews. Thus, to see this in hindsight distorts. To see it living forward is to see it in a different way. Response, reaction is a different kind of thing. Thirdly, I want to say that this is an unprecedented event. I won't go into details of historical comparison. I'll just remark on one event. As late as 1943, Jan Karski, a great figure in the Polish underground, came to Washington to tell them about Auschwitz, and he met Felix Frankfurter, Supreme Court Justice, and he said to Frankfurter, "Do you know what's happening at Auschwitz?" And Frankfurter listened, stunned. And at the end he replied, "I don't deny what you say, but I don't believe it either. I can't believe it either." Can you imagine? Felix Frankfurter could not believe it. No one could believe it. And that's an important thing to remember. Fourth, the Jews of Europe were completely disorganized in terms of a common purpose or a common identity. Despite the lies of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and today of Ahmadinejad at Columbia University, Jews were extremely divided and powerless. Most of the Jews in Eastern Europe also very poor. They did not control the politics of Europe. They did not control its banks or its finance. And even more, they didn't get along with each other. Very Jewish. There were communists and Zionists and Bundists, all of them with a different sense of what Jewish destiny was. For example, the Communist Jews and the Bundist Jews saw their destiny more with the communist circles of the world than with the Jewish people. Also, the Jews were divided by religion, the Orthodox, the non-Orthodox, the assimilated. They were divided by language. They were divided by traditions, local traditions. German Jews were different than Polish Jews. Jews in the Pale of the Settlement were very different than assimilated Jews in Paris. You see this in the war years itself. As late as 43, when they tried to form a common position on resistance in the ghetto in Warsaw, they could not do it because the communists would not join with Betar, with the Zionist youth, which Anna Levitz, the head of the ghetto resistance, was associated with. In the Vilna ghetto, as late as 43, Herman Kruk, a famous diarist of the ghetto, wrote in his diary of June 12, 43, "I would never have joined the resistance if it weren't for our dire circumstances. I cannot stand being together with the Shomrim, as he called them, the Zionists, and the communists." 43. Also, we need to know that the world was a very unfriendly place. In Poland, there was no help for the Jews. Not once during the war did the Polish National Office ask the underground press to put out any kind of remarks about helping Jews. You should know that on the 10th of July, 1941, there was a pogrom in Jedwabne where local people killed 1,600 of their Jewish neighbors. And that pogrom was not isolated. You should know that the Polish National Army not only did not accept Jews into their ranks, but they gave an order during the war to hunt Jewish criminals. In the Ukraine, where millions of Jews lived, Ukrainian nationalists were very, very glad to see the removal of the Jews. I quote from the chief editor of Volyn, a Ukrainian nationalist newspaper in 43, who wrote, "Jews who were brought here from outside the Ukraine must disappear completely from our cities." And he knew about what was happening with the Einsatzgruppen. In Lithuania, where you have a loss rate of almost 97%, you have, even before the activity of the Einsatzgruppen and coincident with it, 40 pogroms of local populations. In Latvia, the Araja Commando, led by a man named Araja, Latvian, killed up to 30,000 Jews without the help of his Nazi colleagues. In Russia, Stalin gave 33 speeches during the war. He mentioned the Jews only once, and then he referred to what was happening to the Jews in November 41 as a pogrom, a Tsarist pogrom. Of course, what was happening was the mass murder of the Jewish people, very different. In 43, the Extraordinary Commission to investigate the killing at Baba Yar, where 30,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days in September 41, did not mention that the people who were murdered were Jews. Talked about Soviet citizens. As late as 1944, Roosevelt himself appealed to Stalin to make a remark in public about the saving of the Jews of Hungary, and Stalin refused. In Hungary, the last great tragedy of the war, I just remind you that there were 800,000 Jews who had still remained safe. Finally, Eichmann arrived in the spring of 44. He took the lead in the program against the local population. 470,000 Jews were murdered in less than 4 months, and he brought with him 100 Germans. All of the 470,000 Jews in Hungary were rounded up, put on the trains, and otherwise mistreated by local Hungarian gendarmerie. In the West, France, of course, was under Vichy, was rabidly anti-Jewish. And ironically, the more the war went on, the more anti-Semitic the population began. I also remind you that Holland, we often think of Holland and the wonderful Dutch friendship. In Holland, you should know that more men joined the Waffen-SS than joined the resistance. And that in Holland, the police and the army were thoroughly saturated, led by pro-Nazi elements. Even, unfortunately, Britain and America were no friends. 2 small examples. 1944, the Jews were struggling to survive. Himmler saw the Reich was going down. He sent a Jew named Joel Brand under his control to try to negotiate for trucks and other munitions to help in return for Jews. 100,000 Jews. Finally, Brand made it to Egypt. He was captured by the British High Commissioner, Lord Moyne. He was kept in jail, and the mission was therefore doomed to fail. And someone said to Moyne, you know, you could save 100,000 Jews. And Moyne replied to him, and what will I do with 100,000 Jews? In 43, the British government agreed to allow 29,000 Jews to enter Palestine under the previous agreed 75,000 figure that had been part of the white paper, but in secret they worked against it, and all the 29,000 Jews, essentially children, died. In America, there was no refugee policy that opened doors. Lindbergh and others led an isolationist front. In 42, when the Auschwitz document was smuggled out of Auschwitz and made its way to America, the United States government came to America in a diplomatic pouch from Switzerland. The American government sent a note to its mission in Switzerland, never again accept such private documents. When Roosevelt agreed to help the Jews of Romania by supplying money, the State Department frustrated it. The Bermuda Conference, the second Bermuda Conference in 43, was so embarrassing, the government did not report its results, all to help the Jews. Therefore, you have to understand that resistance is not a simple matter. Seventh, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches in Russia and Eastern Europe were generally very unsympathetic. Lastly, and here I call to your attention something that bears deep reflection. This was a world that was upside down. Red Cross vans delivered Zyklon B gas at Auschwitz. Orchestras were created to play while people marched to the gas chambers. All the normal rules of ethical behavior. I am struck always by one event you find repeatedly in the literature, the memoir literature, of doctors who in the death camps, female doctors, tell the following story. That when a Jewish woman was pregnant and gave birth, they would immediately murder the baby, usually in a cold bucket of water, so that the mother would not go with the baby to the gas chambers, which would have been otherwise the result. Now, in that ethical world, we have to be very careful. None of us, thankfully, have ever experienced anything like that. So to make ethical judgments is very difficult. As for life in the ghettos, there are many things that need to be said. The ghettos were created in the spring of 1940, and they existed. The last ghetto, the Lodz ghetto, existed till 44, spring of 44. But here, chronology is very important. You have to remember that the Jews began to be ghettoized in the spring of 1940. In 1940, I again remind you, there was no policy of mass murder. And therefore, the Jews came into the ghettos and thought they would live like prior generations had lived in ghettos. But then, of course, things immediately started to go wrong, though not murderous. Food did not arrive, and the average calories that were available in the big ghettos like Lodz and Warsaw were about 300 calories a day. Mass starvation ensued. Everyone was sick with dysentery and other problems. There was no fuel. There was fear, brutality. But still, the Jewish community survived. The bulk of the Jewish community was whole. And it even was happy to be in the ghettos because it prevented people from spontaneous pogroms. It provided some minimal form of security. And the Jewish councils that ran the ghettos, charged with running the ghettos, therefore acted to save the Jewish people in these conditions. When, in the middle of 41, it changes to become a genocidal policy, it is, of course, too late. The Jews are all trapped now in the ghettos. So the chronology provides a little understanding of resistance or the lack thereof. Also, you need to understand the Nazis were not shy about reprisals. They would very, 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 very fiercely attack Jews and the Jewish community if there was any kind of violence. Therefore, you have to take a couple of different kinds of things into account. First of all, on the personal level. Were you a hero if you ran away from a ghetto and left your wife and your children? Were you a hero if you ran away, left grandparents who would not have food? Even Abba Kovner, the great hero of the Vilna uprising, of the Vilna underground, who went on to be a famous poet and his figure in Israel, wrote after the war, "Am I a hero in Israel, or did I betray my mother?" It's a profound question. Also, there were reprisals against groups. For example, in the Vilna ghetto on July 22nd, 43, a small group of Jews fled the ghetto. They encountered some German soldiers. There was an incident. The Germans shot a few of them, captured the rest. That night, the Nazis came into the ghetto, rounded up 32 of their relatives, and murdered them on the spot in the middle of the evening. The next day, the Yiddish ghetto newspaper, Ghetto Yediot, wrote that these people brought it upon themselves because they had violated the rule of the ghetto. In other words, reprisal hung over everyone. And lastly, I would just mention to you reprisal in a more general sense. In Dolhina, for example, small ghetto, 2 Jews ran away. Essentially, they could not be caught. And the Judenrat was told, the Jewish council was told, if you don't bring them forward, we will have mass murder here. 3 days later, they still could not be found. 1,540 Jews were murdered. 2 ran away. 1,540 were murdered. So when you think about the role of the Jewish councils, about the responsibility of the Jewish councils, the people trying to keep the Jewish people alive, you have to understand the kind of existential circumstance in which they lived. And you see that in individual acts. For example, in Vilna, Itzhak Wittenberg, who was one of the leaders of the underground, was discovered to be a leader by the Nazis. they told the Judenrat that he had to come or they would make reprisal. Wittenberg had great moral courage. He went out to the Nazis, and when they took him, he took a cyanide capsule and died because he knew about reprisal. When Jacob Gens, the head of the Vilna Judenrat, was told to report to the Nazi office one afternoon, he was warned they want to murder you. But he understood if he didn't go, there'd be reprisal. So he showed up at 6 o'clock, and at 7 o'clock he was a dead man. One understands this is a very, very unusual circumstance. In addition, in the ghettos, the Jewish councils were working under two mistakes. The first was that they thought Nazi anti-Semitism was like prior anti-Semitism. It was not. Prior anti-Semitism was not genocidal. Whatever one says about the history of Christian anti-Semitism, one thing is certain. The Christian church never sought the physical annihilation of the Jewish people. And usually the popes defended Jews against those who would murder them. Here, based on that model, Jews thought they would survive and they would act the role that they had played in the past. But that was a mistake. They didn't know it was a mistake. They couldn't know it was a mistake, but of course it was a mistake. The second was they thought that if they made the ghettos productive, and all the ghettos adopted a policy called work for life, they would become important to the Reich, and the Reich would keep them alive because they needed slave labor. All over Europe, you know, the Germans were going and stealing slave labor. 7.5 million people were forced into slave labor. Children who were blonde in Eastern Europe were stolen by the Gestapo on the assumption it must have been an Aryan milkman around, and took him back to Germany and raised them as Germans. And the Jews thought that if they would just respond by working for the Germans wouldn't kill them. They needed them. They didn't know that Himmler had already decreed in 1941 a policy of Vernichtung, of extermination through work. Never before in history have masters killed their slaves. But in the end, all the Reich really wanted from the Jews was that they become corpses. Also, you need to know that when you make decisions, you need to have information. But the Nazis purposely misled the Jewish councils. The most famous incident, perhaps, I can give you of this involves Chernyakov, the head of the Judenrat in Warsaw, the largest ghetto. Chernyakov came one day to the Judenrat headquarters in the morning, and everything was a tiz, rumors, gossip. Of course, the ghetto was always full of gossip. And they said there's going to become deportations. They're going to start to murder us. So he ran right away to the Nazi headquarters that he had a liaison with, and he spent the whole day seeing different officers, and each one denied everything. No ghetto will be liquidated, no deportation of Jews, no murder. Finally, at night, he came back. He told the Jewish police, go out into the street, tell the people it's a lie. They'll at least get a night's sleep. He wrote this down in his diary on July 19th, 1942. On that night, the SS group that was going to begin the deportations is already in Warsaw, and 3 days later, on July 22nd, they deported 10,000 Jews, including children, and Chernyakov committed suicide. This happened again in Vilna. Gens was told that a convoy of 5,000 Jews would be deported to Kovna, another city nearby in Lithuania, but of course, instead, they were sent to Ponari, the killing pits outside of Lithuania. And I could give you many other examples. Also, we need to know when we talk of resistance that Jews had no access to arms. Even in the Great Warsaw Revolt, the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943, they had almost no help receiving arms. At a time when the Polish underground was well supplied by drops, by airplane with arms and other kinds of equipment, essentially they gave the Jews almost nothing, and certainly nothing till it began. Also, you need to know that almost everywhere when we talk about resistance and we celebrate it, and there was resistance in places, that most of the important resistance was organized by local national armies. In Russia, the Russian resistance, which was very significant in Western Russia, was organized by the Russian army. In Slovakia, in Serbia, in Greece, in Poland, all over. But the Jews had no national army. and therefore the access to arms. The Jews were the only underground in the war that had no help with military supplies. No airdrops, no assistance of any kind. Also, one needs, of course, to remember that given the policy of work for life and the false assumptions that they worked under, Jews would undertake resistance, armed resistance, only on the certain assumption of death. Only when they knew they were going to be murdered. Otherwise, it makes no sense to make an uprising if you think you're going to live as a slave. So it's only at the point where they become clear that the liquidation of the ghetto is certain. I read you from the Bialystok leader on the eve of the uprising in Bialystok. We have nothing to lose. Do not deceive yourself. The work will not save you. The first action will be followed by a second, and a second by a third, right to the last Jew. The division of the ghetto into different categories is nothing but a perfidious enemy maneuver to ease their task by sowing false illusions among us. Jews, our destination is Treblinka. There we shall be gassed, then burnt like mad beasts. Do not go like lambs to the slaughter. Only at that point, but of course at that point there's no weapons, there's no organization. Resistance is an extremely difficult thing. I want also just to make a word about the Einsatzgruppen murders. The Einsatzgruppen were the fast-moving murder squads created by the Reich to accompany the Wehrmacht, the German army, with the invasion of Russia in June 22-23 of 1941. They killed 1.5 million people in 2 sweeps in Eastern Europe. But you need to know, first of all, there is no precedent for such action, not in the war and not in history. Secondly, the Soviet, as a policy, hid the information about Einsatzgruppen action. Thirdly, Jews had no time to create resistance because the Wehrmacht moved so fast. Remember, the Soviet Union was overrun, dramatically overrun in a few days. 5 million soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. So the Jews had no place to run and no place to hide and no place to organize. Also, the Jews were unaware of what awaited them. We see it in Baba Yar. The Nazis put out a call. Jews should show themselves in Baba Yar. People weren't even asked to come, came to Baba Yar. They thought they were going to be fed, and they were all murdered in 2 days, 30,000. And of course, this violated the whole historic experience of modern history, that the Jews run to the west for safety, not to the east. Historically, Jews leave Russia to find safety. They don't go to the clutches of Stalin to find safety. And so the murder of 1.5 million Jews had no time to resist, no time to organize. To talk about resistance in the case of the Einsatzgruppen is a simple absurdity. Now, having said all of this, and I hope you understand it's an effort to share with you the kinds of sensitivities one needs to have to consider this subject, I want to talk about resistance itself very briefly. First of all, given the assault against Jews, you need to have the right notion of resistance. There were 2 kinds of assaults against the Jewish people. One was what you all know as Auschwitz and Treblinka, the murder of the Jewish people. But in addition, the Jews were also under an assault as human beings. The Nazis denied that Jews were part of the human family. They were called Untermenschen, subhumans. When they referred to the Jews as lice and vermin, that was not a metaphor. When they talked about cancer of society, that was not a metaphor. And therefore, Jewish resistance takes 2 forms. One is spiritual resistance. Anything that resists the dehumanization of the Jew. Anything denying that the Jews do not belong to the human family, that Jews do not have moral dignity, is resistance. And I don't have time, it would be the subject almost for a whole semester, to tell you that there was enormous resistance of a spiritual kind. There was religious resistance. There was the study of Torah by Torah greats. There was the effort to teach children. There were efforts to keep kosher. There were efforts, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, even to open in secret a mikveh before the high holidays. There was the education of children. We just passed Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the various ghettos had secret Yom Kippur services. We also know that the Nazis always made the Jewish holidays a time for special persecution. And they would murder the Jews specifically on the Day of Atonement or Rosh Hashanah. For example, Mengele at Auschwitz, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, singled out Jewish boys to be murdered as a present to the Jews of Auschwitz. There were libraries in all the ghettos, musical performances, theater, high schools. Everywhere, the Jews proved themselves through an enormous list of acts that they were part, not only of the human family, but nobly so. A quite remarkable record of spiritual resistance. And as for physical resistance, I want to say that for all the difficulties, there was more physical resistance than one would ever imagine. In the ghettos, which I've talked about, and which I've described to you, and you have to understand again, think of what it's like to be hungry. 300 calories a day. Cold, sick with dysentery and other illnesses, fearful every time you go off the street, what the next day might bring in the way of a Nazi action of deportation. Still, there was resistance. Armed resistance, not only in the Warsaw Ghetto, but in many ghettos. The earliest was in a small ghetto most people have never heard of, the Nisvich Ghetto in July of 42. And also in the summer of 42 in the Tuchin and Lakva Ghetto. Armed resistance, rebellion. In the Mir Ghetto in 1942 as well. In Bialystok in August 43. In Kletsk, in Goldisha, in Kovna. Kovna is a remarkable story. 140 Jewish police. Jewish police have a very bad reputation. But you should all know in the Kovna ghetto, the SS knew there was a resistance movement brewing. They went to the Jewish police and they said, betray this underground at the fear of your life. 140 Jewish police refused. They were all murdered. And the Kovna resistance continued. In Minsk, about 10,000 Jews were smuggled out of the ghetto because there was a forest nearby, and about 6,000 survived. In Czestochowa in 43, in Tarnow in 43, in Warsaw in April 43. Altogether, I don't have time, and you probably don't want to hear the list, I have found armed resistance activity in 61 ghettos. People hear about Warsaw, they need to know 61 ghettos. In Byelarus alone, there were 90 ghettos in which there was armed activity, not resistance in the sense of an uprising, but armed activity. Remember the sense of ghettos, there were about 1,200 ghettos altogether. In Hungary, in Romania there was ghettos, in Hungary, in Poland, in the eastern area of the Pale of the Settlement, not just Warsaw, Lodz, Bialystok, Kovna, the big ghettos. And all over there was resistance. Also there was armed resistance in 5 concentration camps, one never hears about. In Krushina concentration camp, in the Krishov concentration camp, in the Lublin camp, in the Kopenik camp, and in Sachsenhausen. Resistance, physical armed resistance. And then, most amazingly, there was armed resistance in the death camps. Now here, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to remind you of what the death camps were like. Not for those who died, but for those who were alive. They arrived by long train journeys. Often many of the group traveling by train already were dead. When they stepped off the train, they smelt the burning flesh. The sun never shone at the death camps because the sky was always occluded by the ash belched out by the crematoria. The guards immediately separated the men and the women, and children judged to be 12 or less were sent with their mothers to be gassed. Guards were referred to as pieces, things, objects, and the SS men taunted the Jews that the only way out was by pointing to the gas chamber and the crematoria. The haircuts occurred, tattooing occurred, and then, of course, Jews lived in conditions of unbelievable existential circumstances, almost no food, continual beatings, hours a day at senseless roll calls, every sort of sickness, surrounded by enemies, even in the death camps, where there are different hierarchies. So the inversion of all ordinary experience. The common prisoner was the highest, and he was the capo. And then the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Jews at the very bottom. You also need to know anyone helping a Jew would be put to death. And any attempt, of course, that was intervened with by the Nazis could lead to mass reprisals. Yet there was, despite this extraordinary physical situation, Jewish resistance. In Sobibor, in May 1942, the Jewish Sonderkommandos, those terribly fated young men who did the work of the gas chambers, rose up, killed their guards, and fled Sobibor. Sobibor was soon thereafter closed. Treblinka, in August 2nd of 1943, same thing happened. The Sonderkommandos rose up, killed some of the SS, and ran away. And again, Treblinka was closed in a fit of anger by Heinrich Himmler. And most famously at Birkenau, remember Auschwitz had two halves. There was a non-Jewish Auschwitz where the Polish and other prisoners were kept alive to work, and almost all of them survived. There was Birkenau, which had the gas chambers where the Jews were murdered. In Birkenau, on October 6, 7, and 44, again the Sonderkommandos rose up. 451 of them led an uprising, and they interestingly destroyed one of the gas chambers, one of the crematoria. And after that date, no one else was ever gassed again at Auschwitz. I point that out for one reason. When the Russians liberated Auschwitz at the end of January 1945, there still were about 65,000 people alive. They may well not have been alive at all had the gas chambers continued to work between October and January. So you see, when we talk about the absence of Jewish resistance, that too is a lie. I want to conclude with just a few brief remarks. These are of a comparative nature, and I don't make them to impugn any group's integrity, to cast a dark shadow on any other group, to ask why didn't they resist? Why did they go like lambs to the slaughter? Having spent the last 30 years reading this history, I understand this circumstance and what happens to human beings in it. But I would point out to you that no one asks, why did the 7.5 million forced laborers not cause any revolt anywhere in Europe? Now, their situation was different than the Jews, but still allowing for all differences. They were brutally treated, starved, diseased, mistreated in every form. No resistance, 7.5 million. The national undergrounds that I mentioned to you and that make the Jews always seem poor by comparison, always mentioned about other groups rising up, you should know that it's in some way a myth. The myth is that these groups were active through the war. Most of them were really not active through the war. They waited till the end of the war to become active. In other words, after the Nazi machine was already defeated. For example, in Poland, I read you from a 1941 report that the leader of the Polish underground sent to the Polish government in exile in London. Active warfare against the Nazis cannot take place in our country. Can take place in our country only when the German people will be broken by military defeats, hunger, and propaganda. Following this advice, the Polish underground did not rise up until the summer of 1944, when the Russian army was on the outskirts of Warsaw and the back of the German forces in the east were broken. In Slovakia, again, it only happened in August 44 that there was an uprising. In Czechoslovakia, it's even more humorous in a sense. The uprising only occurred in Prague on May 4th, 1945. But nobody asks about their heroism or their courage. Also, finally, and most directly relevant, is the Russian prisoners of war. Now, here I want to be very careful. I don't want to be misunderstood. This is not in any way to be critical of the Russian prisoners of war. There were 5 million taken in the first few months of the war. Stalin was totally unprepared. The Russian army was overrun by the Wehrmacht, and they made it all the way to the major cities in the interior of Russia. The 5 million Russian prisoners of war, next to the Jews, were the most terribly treated group of any group, perhaps with the exception of the Gypsies, during the war. They were starved, they were beaten, they were singled out for special hard labor. Everything that you can think of except sort of gassing occurred, and even a few were used, for example, to test the first gas vans. 4 million of the 5 million Russian prisoners of war were killed. Now, this was a group that had military experience. They were all physically fit men. They had officers to lead them. They had no family to worry about reprisals being taken in the immediate aftermath of some uprising. Yet not a single major uprising of these 5 million prisoners of war. Now, I don't say that to criticize them for purposes of explanation. Namely, this is exactly what you would expect under those conditions. This is exactly what happens to human beings who are fed the way these people were fed or not fed, beaten, brutalized. So we should understand that when we talk about Jewish resistance, when we see all of the things that were in the way of Jewish resistance that I spoke about at the beginning, under the terms of context and chronology, under the ghettos, under the Einsatzgruppen, and then the brief mention of what the Jewish resistance did accomplish, the 61 ghettos, the 5 concentration camps, the 3 death camp uprisings, the really correct question, which is not asked, the right way to frame this issue is not to say why the Jews not resist, but to wonder at the fact that there was so much Jewish resistance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Katz. This is certainly for me a highly illuminating and instructive talk. We are grateful for it, and it presages great work for your future instruction of our students, graduate students, and colleagues, and we will take it into memory, as we are obliged to do by the occasion and by the gravity of the subject. We will gather downstairs for the reception, and I think Mary Tambay and colleagues will guide you downstairs, second floor, to the second floor. So if you could make your way to the second floor, and we'll have a reception down there. Thank you so much, Professor Katz.